All right, welcome everyone. Please let me know if you can hear me. If anyone's watching, I have no clue. But if anyone's watching, please let me know if you can hear me. I still have PTSD from the one time that I did a live stream for 20 minutes until I found out no one could hear me because I did not go live. Otherwise, let me quickly check on YouTube if I'm actually live. Yep, okay, I'm live. All right, I see it. Good. What's up, Auke at Cuba? Good to have you guys here. All right, so I pushed quite a big update on the back end, arguably a bigger update than on the front end. I'm gonna walk you through all the changes, and I'm gonna start with the most important changes. Hello, Elena. Happy to see you could make it. One of the reasons why I did it later in the day and also Thursdays. So let's go through the changes. I have a little list here. I changed quite a few things, and I'm gonna start with simple to yeah, from the simplest to the more difficult ones. Once again, this is the time to ask questions, but also there's going to be dedicated tutorials being released. I saw Auke just released the first one. Thank you for that. And without further ado, let's just get into it. I mean, the first thing you're going to see, maybe just because it's visually apparent, is this change right here. Now we have these columns here, right? Day since P1, day since P1, and day since P2. This is not the most important change. Arguably, this is, well, I wouldn't say least important. I actually think it's going to be very useful, more useful than I had thought. Let me go over that one first, and then I'm going to go over the most important changes, in my opinion. But here you have this last P1 and the last P2 table, right, where you basically see how many days it has been since a P1 or P2 has been put in for that given hour. So here we can see that currently we have P2 at hour 14. It has been 39 days since SP1 and 21 days since it has been P2. And if everything went correct, if you go to Bitcoin, you should see the same thing. But basically, this is what it's showing, right? It just shows how many days it has been since a P1 or a P2 has been put in. So this is actually really cool. For example, here you can immediately see that, I mean, if you look at the current P2s, you can even filter it. I mean, there's actually, I think this is going to be more valuable than I initially thought it would be. Here we can filter it. So we have all these P2s right now. And you can see that these, I mean, this one, AVAX, has one at hour 10. It's been 209 days since it has been P2. So these P2s are not happening at all lately. And I mean, also in terms of percentages. So those could be interesting ones, right? And you could select these. I mean, this is just me thinking out loud on how I could see this happen. Then you can see that all of them still have a higher probability of displacement and quite a low probability of flipping the P1. So those are interesting ones to look at. I think there's I have some filters applied, so I would have to put those on. Yeah, so this one's not really that valuable, but you understand how it works. I don't want to get into this too deeply because this is one of the easier to understand changes. But so these are now on the dashboard on all pages, so all timeframes. You will also note that we have new assets. We have meme coins, meme USDT. We have Bonk, Pepe, Ship, some others. I mean, there's a list on the new ones. But the most important changes I want to talk about are the filtering method. The filtering method has changed. And I'm going to dive into this first with the weekly time frame because I think it's most important to understand. The filtering method that has changed is, you can see it here immediately. What we had here at first was this one right here, where you'd have the filter mode, manual or automatic. Now it's conservative. We're going to get into that. On the weekly, it completely disappeared. The reason I did this is because I have decided it is just simply sacrificing too much data. We can do this on the daily. As you know, one of the reasons is that to do this automated filtering that we did, basically what it did is that the current P2 would not be on a Monday, but on a Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday or Friday. What we would say is that we'd filter out Mondays. So we do it like this. We'd filter out Mondays. and then look at just this data only, right? Now, the reason I don't do that anymore is simply because, and actually I have to talk with Auke about this today, and Auke, I'm sorry, man, I see you were right. It doesn't have a lot of difference. So I was completely wrong on that. I'll admit that immediately, but there is not a significant difference between Monday and the rest of the weeks, although that is not the main reason why I deleted it. The main reason is that you already don't have much data to work with, right? These are 302 weeks, so this means 150 weeks more or less on this side. And then what you do is that you cut those in half, right? Because Monday happens more or less 50 or 60% of the time. I mean, just select this button and you can see it highlights all the Mondays that put in the P1. That's, I mean, more than 50% if you look at it like that. I do believe it is also more than, I think it's 60% or something. You can easily check by going to the time page. But so imagine removing all that data, you're suddenly left with a lot less data, right? 118 weeks to be exact. So the short of it is simply that you're sacrificing accuracy, as in that you don't have that much data to work with. And it is maybe not even that important on Bitcoin because this one has the most data. But if I, for example, take, I don't know, let's take Doge. Here, look at this. There's like barely any data, right? If you put the Monday in, and you can see, yeah, this is quite some data to work with. And in this case, it's actually quite a similar percentage. But if you would be here instead of here, that would immediately be a massive, massive difference because there's so little data. So the short of it is that on the weekly time frame, I just have decided, and I'm sure, I'm really confident, pretty confident in this, that there's simply not enough data to filter on. And in the background, this was also happening on the summary page, right? That if P2 was on Tuesday, in the background, it was also happening on the summary page. So that also is no longer happening, right? On the weekly time frame page, this is simply going to be covering all the data. And this is a perfectly fine way to do it. I wanna emphasize that. Like it doesn't mean that it's going to be less accurate, the signals. In fact, I think there's a very good case to be made that it's going to be more accurate. We're going to dive into that a little bit more when we get to conservative filtering. But in this case, you're just looking at where is the weekly open or the weekly P1 usually put in, regardless of time. You're just looking at all the data you have all the information available, and that's what you use to make a decision. When P1 on Monday is usually closer, which is really not the case now, it's actually crazy, but if it's usually closer than the rest, then that would mean that I think in practice you're going to get slightly more signals on the weekly time frame. And I also believe they're going to be more accurate because you have to imagine, what is more accurate if you have a 30% chance of something happening based on 50 data points or a 20% chance of something happening in this case, the P1, P2 flip based on 100 data points, right? It's very easy to say that the 20% is way more reliable. Even if you flip them around, it's way more reliable. So the weekly time frame is going to be way more reliable, in my opinion. And that is also the case right here. And we have the same thing right here with week since P1, week since P2, right? Really cool. I actually really like this one. So long story short, no more filtering on the weekly time frame. And the result of that is that you're probably going to get more signals on the weekly time frame and more accurate signals on the weekly time frame, because before I do think that the data was a little bit too filtered out. Which is promising because, in my opinion, when the market is volatile, the weekly time frame was already very accurate and gave us really good signals, and we've been able to really, not predict, but guesstimate the direction of the market. So that's going to increase in the future. Now this change has happened. So to the other timeframes then, where you will see that filter mode has changed from manual to conservative. As you might remember, if you read the previous tutorials, we had clusters, right? We had clusters where we had cluster 0, hour 0, then we had the cluster for hour 1 and 2, then we had a cluster for hours 3 until 11, and then we had a cluster for 12 and later. And the reason for that is, well, you probably know it if you read the tutorials, is simply that the later in the day pivot is put in, the further away it usually is. So if you're at the afternoon hours, you generally can expect that if you put the P1, P2 flip there, then you have a high probability that it's going to be from further away, right? So for example, just to quickly clarify this, if I can press this to, let's just have this one. So if we have P1 right now, P2 at 4%, if we look at all data, there's a 15% probability in quotation marks to put P1, P2 flip. But if we would deselect, some morning hours, I'm not going to do all of it because you probably know it already. And this jumps to 30%, right? So that's because usually if a pivot P1 gets put in later in the day, oftentimes it is closer to daily open or further away from daily open than it is when it's got put in at the start of the day. You can very visually see this if I select only the days that got put in during hour 0, a P1. You can see that all of them, first of all, it's a lot of the data. You see the highlighted part here are all the days that put in P1 at hour 0, but almost all of them, all the ones that are really close to the daily open are put in during hour 0, right? So logically, if you're later in the day, you could say, well, for example, right now, it's hour 15. If we were to perform the P1, P2 flip, it makes sense to look at only the data in the afternoon. And it did make a lot of sense, but I've done a lot of soul searching and I decided to change this because I do think there's a more accurate way to do this. So let me first state that the way we did it was fine, right? There was a good reason for it and it worked. But I do think there is a better way to do it, which is what I did now. In essence, what happened is that instead of having, to explain simply, 3 clusters or 4 clusters in this case, right? We had hour 0, hour 1 and 2, the morning hours and the afternoon hours. We now have 2 clusters. And I wouldn't even, from now on, I'm not even going to refer to them as clusters anymore, but because we have worked with them until now, I think it's important to make that transition. So therefore, I'm still referring to them as clusters. But basically what it is there's 2 groups. There's hour 0 and 1, and there's the rest. So it's simplified. It's simplified, but also more accurate. And I'm going to explain why, or I believe it's going to be more accurate. So if I press conservative now, what it does, it still looks at, okay, I P2 hour select, the current P2 hour is selected. So it looks at, okay, the current P2 is hour 15. And then basically what it does, if P2 is later than hour 2, or hour 1, sorry, so later than this one, then it's going to filter out hours 0 and 1 and look at all the rest. Whereas if this would have been hour 1 or hour 0, it is going to look at all the data. So that's also changed, but I'm going to look at, discuss that a little bit later on. So here, for example, you see here, Bitcoin is hour 0 is P1 and P2 is put in during hour 14. Conservative filter mode filters out hour 0 and hour 1. Yet, if I would press P1 automatic, then it selects the first pivot. You can see everything is selected, right? Because all these balls are green, bluish. And you can see here as well, hour 0 and hour 1 are selectable. Whereas if you press P2 automatic and conservative filter mode, you will no longer be able to select hours 0 and 1. And you can also see that right here, that the data changes. Now, that is probably still clear. Let me now elaborate a little bit on why I made these changes. First, same reason as on the weekly data. I do believe that if you changed all these or had all these different clusters, you're diluting the data too much. And if we would have an equal amount of data for all these different hours of the day for putting in P1, then there's a case to be made that it makes more sense to have like as many clusters as possible, but we do not. So for example, if I press only the afternoon hours, so these are the days that put in P1 during the afternoon, you can see that this is, I'm not even including hour 0 and 1 now. You can see what small portion of the whole data that is, right? It does follow more or less the same distribution, but it's a very small portion of the data. And again, Bitcoin is the one with the most data. If you go to another asset, especially one of the new ones, look how little data this is, right? This just shows, I don't think I have everything selected. Oh, no, wait, I think I did. I actually think I did. So this just shows, this is way too little data. You cannot work with this, right? This is way too little data. You cannot work with this. In other words, having all these clusters would dilute it too much. And in the end, this is an extreme example because this is a new asset that barely has any data. It wasn't this extreme before, so it wasn't like we were making decisions based on this little data. We would have now, but even here with Sol, which has more data, if I would press the afternoon hours, you can see that it's much less data, right? Much less. So the statistical significance just decreases, and it was probably even less if you press the morning hours, because I believe these have even less pivots. No, those actually have even more. But you can see the difference already. But in any case, so that's one of the reasons is that the more clusters you use, the more you disperse the data, the less statistically confident and the more susceptible to extreme swings price are. Because if you have just very little data, then you don't need, and a great example of that was actually that GLM. I have no clue what GLM is, by the way, but a great example here is that you can imagine that visually you already understand that 18.2% doesn't mean much here, and you don't see this if you're at the summary page. Like here, you can see, well, this is not a lot of data at all. But if you're looking at this on the summary page, you see 18.2%. And, if you look at this, you realize intuitively that the 18.2% doesn't mean a lot because you're not looking at a lot of data. You're looking at maybe 15 data points, So that's reason one, to have two pivots or two groups instead of 4 clusters that we had before. And I did this on all the time frames. The other reason is that hours 0 and 1 are the ones that are making the most difference. Why is that? Point 1, hours 0 and 1, when they put in a P1, they are generally the closest to daily open compared to all others. And the difference between hour 0, for example, and all the others is bigger than, for example, the difference between hour 5 and hour, 12, putting in a P1, the average distance or the median distance, probably a good metric to use for that. So these ones have the biggest difference in terms of the average distance from daily open to P1. And besides that, these two together make up for more or less 50% of the data points. You can see this here, right? So these are 50% of the data points because 50% of the days put in the P1 during either hour 0 or hour 1, right? We are not just guessing that, we have that actual data. More or less 50%, in this case 40%, just a little bit more lately, 42%. But it is up towards 50%. So between 40 and 50%, say between 40 and 45%. So it's already a very big amount of data. So that's actually quite crazy to think about, right? That more than 40% of the data occurs just in these two data points alone, and the other 60% are in these data points. That is obviously a lot less. So that already makes it more clear that, making clusters out of a sub-selection of these will dilute the data way more, right? Because you already have 50% here or 40% here. I mean, the 60% over the remaining 20-something hours. So you're diluting the data too much. But the main 2 points is, okay, these are one group because A, they happen closest to the daily open, so they have the biggest difference in terms of distance. B, they occur over 40% of the time, so it's a big selection of the data point, which means they're gonna have the biggest difference, which is what you see here. I mean, if I would deselect hours 0 and 1, you have 15.6%. If I would then deselect hours 2 and 3, see, we went from 10% to 15% deselecting our 0 and 1. Deselecting 2 and 3 went from 15 to 16.9. Deselect 4 and 5 from 16 to 18.4. Deselecting 6 and 7 to 21. So it took us about 6, deleting 6 hours to have kind of the same drastic effect as deleting the first 2 hours. So the summary of it is that making more clusters than this is, in my opinion, a negative trade-off in terms of balance, accuracy, and statistical significance, right? If you have too little data in a cluster, you're going to hurt statistical significance and possibly accuracy, right? As we just see, you might see 15%, but if you have barely any data to 15% of 15 data points is not that much, whereas 25% on 100 data points is way better. So that's why you don't want to have too many clusters. And previously it worked because we did have quite a lot of data on assets, but now it's going to work a lot less. And even on the data points on the assets where we have a lot of how do you say it, a lot of data, I do believe this is going to be more accurate because you have more data to work with. The difference is not that big in between. You can see it here as well, right? If I deselect our 0 and 1, you can just see that the distance between these is not that big. And it even looks bigger now because the starting point becomes different. But you can just see the distance is not that big, right? So the difference is going to be less big, and you're making a trade-off with accuracy and statistical significance, which in my opinion is only going to hurt the accuracy of things. Hence, now we only have 2 groups. We have our 0 and 1, and we have everything later. And that is when you use conservative filter mode, right? So P2 hour 14, if I press conservative, it will recognize that current P2 is at hour 14, and which is later than hour 1, so only these got selected. If I'm going too fast and you have any questions, then please let me know. Now is the time to ask. And again, there's going to be tutorials on this. There's already one selected or uploaded just now. But the next thing is important to understand, or let me just actually, because conservative filter mode changed quite some things. So what you're basically doing with conservative filter mode is that right now we have a pivot at hour 0 and a pivot at hour 14. We are asking yourself, instead of saying, okay, where normally if you don't have conservative filter mode, you're asking yourself just, okay, where in this space does a pivot usually get put in? With conservative filter mode, we're saying, okay, if a pivot P1 is put in during any of these hours, so not hour 0 or 1, how far is that usually from the daily open? And we know that that is usually not here, right? Not somewhere here close to the daily open. And therefore, the reason why it's conservative is because removing this usually gives you a higher estimate. Let me show you that on the tutorial that Auke just uploaded, I think. Let me check. Yeah, there it is. Thank you, Auke. Just showing an example. So here is one more example where you have 66.3% with all hours selected and 85.2% with hour 0 and 1 unselected, right? So this indicates a lower probability of P1 holding, or at least less confidence. And that's simply because if you have these unselected, you remove a lot of the assets or a lot of the days that put in the P1 close to the daily open. So it's called conservative because this percentage is usually going to be higher, and therefore it's a more conservative estimate, which means that if you're using conservative filter mode and this asset's going to be lower, then that's going to be a more confident signal. But I'm gonna dive into that a little bit more later. Now, what this is going to do in practice is that if P2 is at any of these hours, then most likely the percentage of this is going to be a little bit higher. Not sometimes it's going to be lower, I saw, but oftentimes it's going to be a little bit higher. It's going to be more accurate, and it's probably going to give less false negative signals or false positive signals. So what I mean with that, you probably can experience it less, that you see 15.6% when P2 is at hour 8 or something, and that it takes out the other pivot. So the P1, right? That it does the P1, P2 flip. It's probably going to happen less often, in my opinion. So it's going to be more accurate. And the reason for that, I'm going to explain later. Another important takeaway I want to mention is that if we had P2 in hour 0 or P1 in hour 0, in this case P2 automatic selected, what happened before is that we only filtered the data on hour 0. I can actually show you this by selecting P1. Right, then the automatic filter mode would only select this one. Right, in this case, you can see the big difference, 55.3% against 80 something. But that no longer happens. So what this did is that sometimes you had a very high probability play at the start of the day, and then you took out P2, and then suddenly this percentage shot up. Pretty much what's happening here, right? So we have 55.3, and then you take out P2 later in the day, and then bam, this percentage shot up. Because I think this actually gave quite a lot of false positive, and because it created a lot of confusion, I deleted this. Right? There's a case to be made to use it, but I just don't think. I think it causes too much confusion. So right now, if P1 or P2 is at hour 0, you usually have P2 selected. It does not just filter on hour 0. It just looks at the entire day. So in short, if P2, if you have P2 automatic selected, that is, if the hour is later than hour 1, it's going to delete hour 0 and 1. If it is not later than hour 1, so if P2 is at hour 0 and 1, it's going to look at all the data. All right, now we're going to come into the really nitty-gritty things. Let me check my notes, so I'm going to talk about the right thing. Yeah. Now I'm gonna talk about using the conservative filter mode or the manual filter mode. So pretty much the conservative filter mode is closest to what we have been using so far, right? Only that there's less clusters, and in my opinion, this is going to improve accuracy and reliability, and probably also frequency. So that's the gist of it, right? So we just simplified the cluster system. On the weekly, it is removed. On the 8-hour, the clusters are, well, just started, but the groups are simply the first. Actually, on all the time frame, it's just the first one, because we have less time slots here, right? So if P2, if conservative filter mode is selected, then if the current P2, if you have P2 automatic selected, is later than the first block gets filtered out. 4 hours, same thing. First block gets filtered out. And 1 hour, same thing. The first 5 minutes got filtered out. And it's all for the same reason. You can see this one is now filtered out, because the first block always has the biggest difference in terms of distance. They usually get put in closer to the 4-hour open, 8-hour open, or 1-hour open. Plus, they have more or less 50% of the data. But now I want to show you the real impact of using, because what you can do now, another thing is what I decided to include is you can select your filter mode or not. So for example, look at the difference. If I have P1 filter mode, so this really applies to P1, this is the same filter as here, right? I think that's clear. So the filter mode, conservative, manual. Obviously this filter mode applies usually to this one. So what you can do, you can select that now on the summary pages as well. And first, let me see the impact of it. If I select no filtering mode, I mean, look at that, right? Way more signals, way more. Conservative. See? So this is going to give you a lot more signals. By the way, you can also see here if you see insufficient data. So those are the new assets that don't have enough data for the week, but do have enough data for the day or less. So we have some nice ones now, right? Pendle, Yelena, I know you wanted this one. Or the SSV, I think you wanted this one as well. Sui USDT. Tia, I mean, there's WildCoin with. But anyway, I digress. So we get a lot more signals when you use P1 filter mode none versus conservative. And again, this is the one we kind of have been using. So why is this, right? Why is this? Well, the reason can be, or let me put it like this, why is this and which one would you prefer to use? And I'm going to explain that. And I'm going to explain my thinking because I've done a lot of thinking about this one. And I think it's fair to use both, actually. It's a personal preference, but let me explain. So, first of all, why does this happen? Well, it is simply because of what we have been discussing so far. And that is that if you use manual versus conservative, conservative is going to filter out all these, right? So this percentage is always going to be usually going to be higher, especially when P2 is somewhere during the morning hours. So if you press no filtering mode, right, this is pretty much the same as on the none on the summary page. The reason I have what manual here is that you can actually select hours to your own disposal. But so therefore, this is always going to be high. You can see this with width. So on manual filter mode, looking at all data, we have 15.6% here. But if we press conservative, so we filter out hour 0 and 1, we go to 26.9. And you saw that on the multi-time frame summary page, we went from bull to strong bull. And this is the reason. And you can kind of see it now as well, right? Like, I mean, this is 26 point. Which one would you trust more? This one, 26.9, or the manual one here, 15.6. I mean, I do think you can use this one, but the less the data you have, the more I would use manual, that's for sure. But in this case, I do think you can use all of them. But I mean, imagine if you would have even used more clusters. But the reason why this is increasing is because of this, right? Because this meets the threshold for a strong bull. It has to be less than 20%. But if I go to conservative, it doesn't meet that threshold anymore. So basically what it means is that if P2 is put in later than hour 1, 26.9% of days put in the P1, 7.5% away from daily open or more. And if you just look at all the data, then it's only 15%. So this is the reason why you're going from bull to strong bull on WIF and many other assets on the multi-time frame page. If you look at that, so let me check this here. Strong bull, right, on none, conservative, bull. So the thing is that none, if you apply no filter mode, is going to give you way more signals and way sooner. Whereas this is going to give you less signals, but arguably more confident signals. So if you say more confident, then you might be wondering, why would I ever use normal? And the reason is that there is an argument to be made that it might not be more accurate, actually. I think it really depends. So this is obviously something we're going to have to test. But I've done a lot of brain searching and soul searching on this matter. And you have to think about it like this. I'm going to explain this the best way I can, but I understand this is a little bit more complicated. You have to think about it like this. If you use conservative filter mode, what you are looking at is not simply the question, where does P1 usually get put in, right? So you're not looking at here, where does P1 usually get in. You're looking at where does P1 usually get in if the P1 is after hour 1, right? That is the difference in what you're doing. Now, until now, I've only allowed for this kind of filtering mode because to me, it made a lot of sense to look at only, right now P2 is hour 14. So you kind of want to know, okay, how far is that P1 usually? Because it will give you the most accurate description of the P1, P2 flip probability, right? Because we're past hour 0. And if we would do the P1, P2, if we would take our P1 now, we would do it from, an afternoon hour. And usually they are further away from the daily open. So this is completely valid. I still believe in that reasoning, but I also believe there's a nuance to be made on it now, because the one thing you're doing is that if you use conservative filter method, you are removing a lot of information out of the equation, right? You are removing this. In essence, you're removing some time essential information on this thing. As we have seen, these hour 0 and 1 have more than 40% of the occurrences. That in and by itself is a metric by itself, right? It is a very important data point by itself. So if you remove this, you're removing a very important data point, which is that it is a simple fact that most often we put in a P1 during hour 0 or 1. And yes, that is most often going to be closer to daily open than P1. So in essence, if you would not put this away, you could argue, and to be honest, it is a simple, almost a fact, that you're going to get a more accurate description of reality, right? Because you're simply including 40% of the data points. You're simply saying, well, it's important to, like the judgment call you're making is, well, it's important to take this into account because for the simple fact that 40% of the time, this actually happens. And if you take this one, it would even be 50% of the time. So, a really big amount of times, we actually get a P1 close to that. So if I press conservative filter mode, I am removing that piece of information that happens so often. So yes, I get a more conservative estimate, but you're basically looking at a sub-selection of the data set that does not account for one of the most important or two of the most important hours in the day for putting in a P1. Two of the most important hours. So one could argue that if you do not remove those, and you simply look at, okay, I want to know when during the day this pivot is put in, then that's going to be a more accurate representation of reality because suddenly we are looking at all the data, we have all the information available to us. We're simply saying we're not discriminating any hour or whatever. We're simply saying, hey, this is the data. We just want to know where P1 gets put in from the daily open. And that's it, right? We just want to have the complete picture. So this, not applying any filtering, will give you the more complete picture. Now, obviously, this will probably work better if we do not get a P1, P2 flip later in the day, right? This is the catch-22, which means that it's going to work like way better, more or less 50% of the time. But that is just assuming right now. But anyway, the takeaway of that is, well, then again, it happens 50% of the time, so it's important to take that into account as well. But this is the reason why I call this conservative, because you're taking away some important data points. It's going to increase your metric. It's going to increase this metric by a lot or by quite a significant amount. And that is by itself reason to call it conservative, because that metric increases and you're basically looking, okay, 60% of the time we are putting in a P1 somewhere here. I want to know for those 60% of the time how often it happens from this. But for example, I could see that if you see at the start of the day that you have a very strong P1 at hour 0, you might want to put manual filtering. And when you do not have that, you might want to put conservative filtering, right? I wanted to give more choice to the end user as well on this, because in the end, I do want to work to a product where there's customization available. So this in the end is also going to be up to you. But I think for me, what I'm going to do is that when I see prices heavily trending, I will definitely put it on manual, which is going to give way more signals. It's going to give way faster signals. And when price is trending, and it's going to put a lot of pivots in closer to daily open, closer to hour 0, hour 1. It's going to give faster signals, and probably more accurate signals. If price, however, is more ranging, I mean, I'm less interested in continuation trades anyway, as you probably know by now. So I wouldn't act on it regardless. But, you know, if I'm less confident about the pivot, I might choose to do that. Or you might choose, you know, maybe we'll experience, it's also something we'll have to experience, that it simply even works better when you have it on manual, because those simply happen a lot, right? But regardless, the main summary is that filter mode conservative will give you a higher estimate of this, and manual is going to give you a lower one, aka manual is going to be more aggressive. It's going to give you faster signals. You know, it's going to give you faster confidence for the P1 holding, but you're taking into account all the data rather than a subselection of data. Whether with conservative, you're only looking at the subselection of the data, where you're saying, well, if we get the P1, P2 flip now, what are the odds of that happening? So that is the difference between those. Both are valid. If you have any questions, let me know. But again, tutorials are being uploaded. I'm going to write a deep tutorial on this. In my opinion, both are valid, right? Because once again, even though it's very valid to look at right now, it's P2 hour 14. So that means that if we have the P1, P2 flip, yes, it is definitely valid to say that, okay, well, we shouldn't look at these, because we know it's at hour 14, so it's never going to be close as hour 0, usually not, which is completely fair. But the one thing you're sacrificing is the data, the simple fact that, you know, 40% of the time this does happen, this P1, right? So you're just looking at, okay, how far do we usually put in the P1, regardless of when the P1 is put in. And in this case, you know, we can say that, well, only 10% of the time, if you're not taking anything into account, only 10% of the time, it would be this far from the daily open. So once again, if we go to the multi-time frame summary page, we press conservative, couple of bulls, lots of bulls, couple of strong bulls versus none. Lots of strong bulls, lots of bulls. Right, so this one's more aggressive, and this one is less aggressive, right? And it's conservative. And again, my first thoughts are, obviously these ones have the potential to give more false negative, but I do have, I have to see that though, because one of my reasonings is that, you know, there might be also a lot of, this is probably going to give more false positives, where you, for example, see strong bull when you take out the P1. But I do think that also this one has the potential to not give a positive. So say, for example, it will stay on undecided or simply bull, whereas, and then price went up. So it didn't give you that strong bull signal, right? So the question is, how many false positives will this give, opposed to how many more signals will this give that turn out to be true rather than conservative? And that's going to determine the average success rate of it. But even if that ratio is unfavorable, this one is going to work better, in my opinion, in trending markets, and this one is going to be more accurate in less stronger markets, right? Whenever a pivot is just very strong, I think P1 none will be better to use, but maybe it will work better all around. We'll have to see. Either way, you can play around with it yourself. If you're not sure, just use conservative. It's pretty much the same thing that we used, only more accurate. All right. Moving on. Anil, I see your question. Yeah, the same logic can be applied, but I removed that actually in this update. I mentioned that. You probably tuned in later, but I'll repeat it. But I mentioned that at the start because there is not enough data. It doesn't make sense to do it. For example, if you look at Doge, which has, a reasonable amount of data. It has 169 weeks, so more or less 3 years. Imagine you deselect Monday, you go from under 92 weeks to 66 weeks, right? And this is 3 years of data because there's only 52 weeks in a year. So this diminishes the amount of data you have greatly, and therefore it's not worth it, right? And no longer is the trade-off worth it. And also in this case, it's actually crazy. On Monday, it's actually higher for Doge, but therefore the trade-off is no longer worth it. You cannot sacrifice statistical significance for accuracy, because if you have no statistical significance, you generally sacrifice both statistical significance and accuracy. So therefore, I decided to remove it altogether. So this option is present for all time frames except for the weekly, and I think it's completely fine not to do it on the weekly. I honestly think, because we used to filter out Mondays in the previous version, but I personally think that this is going to give more accurate signals on the weekly, and it's going to give more frequent signals on the weekly as well. On the 8 hour, 4 hour, 1 hour, all of this is possible though. So here we have the same thing, P2 mode, automatic on the 1 hour. Well, maybe 4 hours still in P2 hour 1, but if we go to the 4 hour and we have P2 automatic and we set filter mode to conservative, we can see that the current, it doesn't matter. The current P1 is put in the first 30 minutes, current P2 second 30 minutes, and we see that the first time block is filtered out. And you can see the difference it makes, right? 56.9 to 82.7. Yeah, I also definitely have to do some forward testing on how well this works, but I have a hunch that this might actually work pretty well to do no filtering at all, especially in certain conditions. But if you're not sure, conservative is definitely a good way to go. All right, so next up, how are you? What's up, man? Yeah, signals, man. I really hate that word. I shouldn't be saying it as much, but otherwise I have to keep making very long descriptions of things. I'm sure everyone knows what I mean. So the other thing right now is that before, if we had anything selected, we had to manually select the current 4 hour candles, because as we know, there's a big difference in the distance. So for example, we have now selected a 0.8% distance here. If I would, for example, look at this 4 hour candle, this would give me a metric of 27%, versus this 4 hour candle that would give me a metric of 18%. So, that's a big difference, right? And that's because different 4 hour candles, different 8 hour candles, different hourly candles behave differently. And the annoying thing was that you had to manually select these. No longer, if you have P1 or P2 automatic selected, what it does, you can see it here, it automatically checks which candle we're in. Right now we're at the candle 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., right? It's almost 5 p.m. UTC. So it will automatically select this 4 hour candle. So the data is automatically filtered properly. It does the same on the time statistics page. So here you can see same thing. And you can see how big the difference is if you don't. So 58.6 goes out to 51. But I mean, for example, if you would press this one, 39%, right? Massive difference. That's why it's important to have the right candle selected. So this happens on all time frame. Also on the 1 hour. See, we have the current hour selected now. Instead of all hours. So you don't need to, different hours really behave differently as well. And finally, on the 8 hour, we have the same thing, and then it selects the current 8 hour candle, right? So all the same thing. Long story short, we no longer have to select which candle it is. If you have input mode set to automatic, or on the disk space P1 or P2 automatic, then it automatically selects the current 4-hour or 8-hour or 1-hour candle, so you have the most accurate data. Obviously, this one is different, but I think this one speaks for itself. Now you can just compare the different P1s over time, right? So this is, or how many highs, not P1s, highs or lows, but just which one puts in the most pivots. And the one's mostly interesting for some time frames. For example, I like the sessions, the weeklies. You go to here, for example. Yeah, this one's pretty cool. I really like this one. And you can look at how the sessions develop, how important they are for putting in pivots. As you can see, New York is generally the most important with Asia, and you can select here the moving average. This works for both of these charts, by the way. So if I put 50 days instead of 100, then this will be calculated over the last 50 days. And you can see that the post-session has really been picking up lately. But all in all, I do like the higher time frame view because it just gives more of like a confident estimate over the long-term time frame. And then you can see that just New York is very reliable to put in a lot of pivots, as is Asia, by the way. So this drop is interesting. Like this massive rise and then the drop. I mean, you can go to the chart and check it. But that's that. That's pretty simple. Yeah, good to note that now also, so beforehand, the 4-hour and 8-hour summary pages already chose the correct 4-hour or 8-hour or 1-hour candle, but now this also chooses the 1-hour. This data is now filtered on the current 1-hour candle, right? So it basically does the same as we had on the distance page where you saw that if you now automatically or put it automated input mode, then you see that it selects the current 1-hour candle, and here it does the same only then on the background. And this pivot group here was first here, right? It didn't change in terms of feature. I just removed it. So it just changes whether you're looking at 10-minute data. So this is only relevant for this one right here, 10-minute data, or pivots in 10-minute blocks or 5-minute blocks. There's tutorials on that one already. But the most important change is 100% the filter mode. So once again, to quickly recap that, the logic is the same for all the time frames except for the weekly, where the filter mode got deleted because I do think it's going to be more accurate. We now have filter mode conservative instead of automatic, which basically means that we're no longer filtering on different clusters. We're simply taking out hour 0 and 1 if the current P2 is later than hour 1, in this case hour 14, so it's later. This is that it gives us a more realistic image of a P1, P2 flip later in the day, right? So if that happens, what is the chance of that? The benefit of not doing that is that it gives you a more complete picture of, like, this automatically weights the chance of that happening, right? That's the right word. It automatically applies weight if you don't do it, because 40% of the time that will not happen. So if you do not filter for it, then basically what you're saying is, well, you're automatically weighting the importance of that first hour. So the eventual statistic that you get will be more automatically weighted. And obviously there is some favor towards being close to daily open, but that's simply because it happens a lot. So it's, in my opinion, pretty fair to use that. But we'll have to do some testing all together on that. I'll definitely be keeping a close eye on it. I'm definitely gonna play around with it. So that's the thing that happened. And then also we will no longer have the situation where P1 and P2 is an hour 0, and then suddenly this Once we take out P2, this probability spikes up by a lot. It's just too confusing, so I removed it. Let me know if there's any questions while I go over my notes to see if there's anything else I missed. Nope, I think I have handled everything. So let me recap. I changed the cluster system. There's no longer clusters. There's just two groups, right? The first in, the daily, hour 0 and hour 1. Here, what we just discussed, and the rest. And on the other time frames, except for the weekly has none. But on the lower time frames, we have just the first one as its own group, and conservative filters based on that. The reason for this is that it increases the data we work with. Hence, it increases statistical confidence. Hence, it will probably increase the accuracy, because I think there were probably more false positive due to the clustering method with little data. I also think it over-importancized the time. If you have too many clusters. For example, one of the things I thought about that, I think there's a lot of false negatives on when you had a really good probability on P1 when automated filtering was selected and only hour 0 was selected, because I think it gave a more biased view than necessary, and that will no longer happen. Because you could also argue that, okay, this is one of the things I weighed in as well for not only selecting hour 0, that you could also argue that, well, there's a good case to be made that the reason that is a much lower percentage at that time is that price has a lot less time to make a move like that in 1 hour than it does in 14 hours, right? It could still be, if you have 14 hours in a day, it could still be one candle that takes you to a high level, right? Like one very impulsive candle. But if you have 14 hours in a day, you will have had much more time for that to happen than if you only have 1 hour in the day, and therefore the probabilities are obviously going to be higher for that to happen. But it doesn't mean that in 14 hours and in 1 hour, but it doesn't mean that if it happens in the first hour, that therefore the move is less significant, right? And therefore it could skew the probabilities. So that's no longer going to happen, which therefore I think is going to be more accurate. The 1 hour is definitely going to be more accurate because now it filters properly. It also has better filtering with this as well. It's kind of the same thing. So I changed that. Conservative filter mode is now also available on the summary pages. So once again, very simply put, and again, I'm going to write extensive tutorials on this, but conservative is conservative, as the name implies. None, you're going to be a little bit more aggressive, right? And there's definitely, I think, a case to be made to do that. Once again, P1 filter mode, none. First conservative, lot less signals, right? So, conservative, aggressive. But aggressive is not even the right word. Aggressive means, like, I would argue that not using conservative filtering is the more accurate description of reality, so to say. Doesn't mean it all will always be better. I'm going to find out, but it definitely displays the more accurate or the bigger picture, better than conservative filtering does. Then we have the new chart on the time page on the top right. And let me check. We have the new columns here. This is P1, this is P1, this is P2, right? Which will give us additional insights. Pretty cool, if I may say so myself. So for example, now we know that these have a very low probability of flipping to P1. And what we can then even do, if you press shift and you select this one, then it will order on this one first and then order on this one. So now we see, for example, that Sui, no clue, Sui, this one has a very low percentage chance of happening as the current P2, hour 7, has a low percentage chance of happening as P1 and a very low percentage chance as happening as P2. It hasn't happened for 98 days, and this one hasn't happened for 101 days. So that's an interesting one, right? And then you can select this one. So this actually opens up a whole new way of looking at things. And the only thing is that, this one is not very generous, so to say. You could press normal filtering, but even then, don't think I would go for that. I mean, you could still go for it based on this alone, right? 98 days and 101 days. So you know that the current P2 is probably not gonna be P1 if this holds, and also not gonna be P2. So, but preferably you would see this have a good value as well. It doesn't. You have these two. So for example, this one is nice, right? Bitcoin Cash. 74 days since the current P2 has been P1, 137 days since the current P2 has been P2, so low chance. And you see here, and then you would say, well, then this one's probably targeted. Interesting. Although this one is also, it's been a while. But so these columns have been added as well, and with that, those were all the features. And obviously we have more assets now. We have more meme coins. And I'm also actually really looking forward to the 1 hours, because this one is going to be a lot more accurate, in my opinion, with the changes I made. Yeah, you can see that now it doesn't matter if it's conservative or none, simply because the current P2 is in the first block still. So as we know, then we are looking at all the data. And before it would have only looked at the hours that put in P1 during the first 5 minutes, which would give a much lower percentage, and that's no longer going to happen. So I actually think that's going to be good for accuracy as well. So that's all it. I know it's might be complex. It's also, I'm not going to lie, a little bit complex to explain for the first time. It's especially because it's more like a back-end thing. A lot of the most important parts, but I'm going to write tutorials on this. It will also be, especially with using no filter mode, will also be a little bit experience for me as well. So as the months go on or the weeks go on, I will definitely be putting out more content on that, which is also one of the reasons why I'm doing more streams this week, because then I immediately get a little bit of grasp on it. Also, one of the reasons why I'm doing more streams, it will give you the time to read some tutorials, jump on the stream. I'll be using these new features, these new settings, explaining them. It will give you a bit better understanding of them. So if you don't understand it now, don't worry. Tutorials are coming tomorrow at the latest. I'm going to do my best for that. And then Wednesday and Thursday are streams again, so we can look into that. And you can ask any question. And besides that, it will give a better view just of how I use it or how I'm going to use it. If this is blank, by the way, that simply means there are no records found where this was P2. So there's no record found that the first 5 minutes also became the P2 of this hour, which makes sense. Let's check the 4 hour. So right now, I mean, if we check only candles with more distance, we want that big enough 50%. Oh, never mind. Oh no, wait, we do. And this one less than 25%. So we have some very nice plays actually on the 4 hour. All bullish or some bearish. And if we would press conservative, we would have a lot less. See? So there's a big difference in using conservative or normal. But all these look interesting, especially these, Ordian ball. All right, guys. So that's it. I hope it wasn't too confusing. But once again, if it's not clear now, we have 2 more live streams and tutorials coming up for this week. So I'm sure it will become more clear. I do really believe this is going to increase the accuracy of the dashboard. It's going to increase the frequency of signals on the weekly for sure. Also on the hourly. And I also believe we're just going to it's just going to do a better job. Especially this new filtering method. Plus, usability has increased quite a bit. Right now, we no longer have to press the current hour or the current 4 hour. It just selected for us immediately. Right, current 4 hour selected. Amazing. So much more user friendly now on the lower time frames too. All right, guys, thank you very much for listening. As long as you did, if you're still with me, appreciate it. I hope the new dashboard or the new update will do you a lot of good. I do think it will. Let me know if any questions after the stream. You can always drop them in the Discord. I will answer them. If not, I'm going to wish you a very good day. And I'm already going to see you on the next stream on Wednesday, which is with Tim. And then Thursday, we have a stream. I have a stream by myself where I'm going to obviously dive more into the dashboard and explain what I'm looking at and how I use the dashboard. And I will pay special attention to the new features. So thanks again for watching. And we will be seeing each other.